Tutoring in the English discipline is usually contained to composition classes, English 96, English 101, and English 102. We're going to hear from several faculty members at Harold Washington College about how they use embedded tutors within those classes.
Thinking about discipline-specific tutoring strategies for English, one of the most important strategies, I think, is always to ask to see the student's work. I think pretty often if you ask students, like, do you have a question? They're going to say no. Right? No, I'm fine. It's good. I'm fine. If you ask, though, to see their draft and then you can look at what they're working on, then you can offer feedback. I think starting out early in a semester, early in that tutoring relationship, offering positive feedback first is always really important. They talk about something as is it a compliment sandwich? I forget the name of it. Anyway, you offer something positive and then something to work on, and then you could offer something positive again. But I think at least having the two things together, right? Always look for something positive in a student paper, even if you read the paper and you're like, ooh, right? There's always something that you could comment on, right? Like, I love the title that you've got here, or your concept for the hook in this essay is really interesting. And then help the student think about ways that they can make their work stronger, right? The goal when you're tutoring English is never to fix a student's paper for them, but it's always to work with the student so that they have the tools to fix their own paper, right? To work on their own writing, to make their own ideas clearer, stronger, more expressive, more interesting, easier to read, right? It's always for them to have the tools. So thinking about, say, maybe an introduction to an essay where the student has some interesting descriptive details, but is running into a bunch of fragments and is missing a thesis statement, right? You might say something like, this introduction is so interesting. I love what you're doing with the imagery here. I see how you've got these details here with the description, just like we've talked about in class, because of course, if you're embedded, right, you're there for that part of things. I love how you've used the details there. What I'm noticing, though, is that all of these aren't complete sentences. Especially when you're starting out that conversation, then it's interesting to ask the student, do you know which of these is not a complete sentence? And they might say, oh, yep, that one. Okay, I can fix that, right? And then it's a different conversation versus if the student says it's a what? Then that's a slightly different conversation also. And then you can say, okay, so do you remember what a complete sentence needs? And then, kind of start to break things down. What I like to do also is to scaffold it. So on the first example, I'm going to, if the student really doesn't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to show them an example and say, this is not a complete sentence, right? So we talked about a complete sentence needs a subject, it needs a verb, it has to express a complete idea. And this sentence is missing whichever, one of those things. So this one's not complete. If I wanted to make it complete, what I would do is I would add that subject. So now see if you read it through like this and read it out loud, right? Then you have a complete sentence. So I've worked through that first one essentially for them. I'm not going to keep doing that though, because that doesn't give them the tools. So I've worked through one, right? Then I might point to the second sentence and say, okay, this one is the same kind. I'm wondering if you can figure out how to fix it and let them try. If they get it, then I might say, okay, there's two more sentences like that on this first page here. Can you find those and try to fix them? And then call me over when you're done and I'll come and see what you did. If the student really struggles on that one that they did on their own, I might help them a little more with that one and then give them the next one to work on their own. So I'm always kind of scaffolding it back onto the student where it's I do it, and then we do it, and then you do it. So eventually it's them who's able to look at their sentence and say, oh, this is a fragment. Let me know how to fix this, right? Always important to use the terminology that the instructor is using also. For example, in my class, I don't necessarily use all of the very complex grammar terms. I sometimes use simpler ones, and the students might use those terms also. So just to acknowledge the terms that the students are using and the knowledge that they bring in with them. They may have a good innate understanding of sentence structure that predates their enrollment in the class, and then you may not need to go over that with them as much. They may not have a firm grasp on sentence structure, and there's any number of reasons, right, that they may have that struggle. Maybe they missed that day in class. Maybe this is something that they've always had trouble with. Maybe there's kind of other influences there that have made this a struggle for them. So I think just meeting the student where they are and, seeing what they know, right? Kind of assessing as you talk to them, as you read, what they're aware of, and then building from there and saying, here's what you need to know to kind of help make this more clear, right? I think there's a way to do that also with an essay. where you're making them feel, good about it. To go back to that example of the paper with the strong hook, but with the fragments, right? So to say, you know, once you've worked through the sentences and stuff, so you could say something like, I know that this feels really tricky, right? But what we're doing here is you have these awesome details, and we really just want to take your sentences and make sure that the sentences are in the same level, right? They have the same strength as those details, so that we get these details in really clear sentences, and then your introduction is going to be amazing, right? So kind of working them through that. You can also sort of think about how many things you can practically tackle in a tutoring session, right? And priorities. If the student hasn't written a thesis statement, doesn't have topic sentences, hasn't filled in the paragraphs, has no conclusion, and also needs to work on sentence structure, you're probably not going to get through that in a single sitting, right? So what do they need to work on today? Maybe today you want to help talk to them about brainstorming ideas for their other paragraphs and finishing the conclusion, and encourage them to come back, right? When they come back, then maybe you want to talk about getting the structural sentences in there and perhaps start sentence structure. Then you encourage them to work on the sentence structure on their own and come back. And then you can go through the sentence structure stuff, check that together, and see if they've kind of made that progress on it or if they're still needing some help. So kind of triaging, if you will, thinking a little bit about what it's possible to accomplish in a single tutoring session, and what you could accomplish in a future session, and then encouraging the student to do that and following up with them, right? If you're an embedded tutor, if they don't come, then when you see them next, to say, hey, I missed you on Wednesday. Is everything cool? When can we talk about your paper, right? I always like to ask my tutors to have sort of an aggressive helpfulness, right? So to say, like, let me see what you've got so far. I'd love to see your thesis statement, right? Like, hey, we missed you. We missed you on Monday in class. Let's catch up on this. Do you have time to talk afterwards? So you're following up with the students, and they feel that you care about them. I think when they really have that understanding and that trust, they're much more willing to come to a tutoring session. They're much more willing to sit and come multiple times and continue to work on a paper. And then working on it together becomes almost, sort of a fun project, rather than like, oh, I have to go see the tutor, right? So like, yeah, we're going to work together and I'm going to figure this essay out. So those are some of the strategies that I would encourage English tutors to use when they're working on composition.
So in a comp class, if you are using an embedded tutor, what I would suggest is using them to help reinforce the rules of grammar, right? Which that is across the board. And that's one of those things that everybody is so different in terms of their abilities. And so being able to differentiate, so you could have some who are struggling with subject verb agreement work with a tutor. Well, then I can work with other students who are working on, commas between dependent or independent clauses. So there's different, levels, and so we can mix it up that way. Also, in terms of organization of an essay, how to structure it, and then reading assignments and how to annotate. Working with the student carefully, especially if it's silent reading time, you can walk around and watch them as they are reading and annotating and answer questions. And so I could take half of the class and tutor can take the other half of the class. And then of course, if you're working in 102, being available both in class and outside of class, which is one thing that I think is really important about the tutoring relationship, is knowing that I am not the only person that the tutor can go to in terms of office hours. And in English 102 in particular, it gets really heavy on like the big thinking stuff. And so,
and you're working with 20, it's almost like 25 different classes.
That's right. Everybody's got different topics.
It's like 25 mini different classes.
Yeah. So for Jerome knowing, or the tutor knowing, that these are all of the ideas that everyone had come up with, for me, what was fun about English 102 is that like there's some stuff that Jerome, like topic wise, really grooves off of, and so could really do a great job mentoring that student in the topic, because that's his bag, right? So be whatever it is, and then I've got my own, stuff that
If they want to come to me about sports, that's great. If they want to come to rabble rousing public schools, that's...
Yes, right, exactly. So you can divide it up in terms of, the feeling of the topic and how much you drive from it. So it really, it's the uses are endless, but it really does help to have two sets of eyes and two sets of brains in the classroom to help the students, rise in 16 weeks, because it's not a lot of time.
It really isn't. And I can speak from my experience as both tutor and teacher. In working with, I'm actually working with a tutor who's much more into grammar than I am. So a lot of what they're doing is they're doing a lot of the grammar work because that is something that I don't feel comfortable teaching in the classroom as much. I mean, I know the grammar rules, but I just think grammar is so individual that I think that's where it really works out. So from that end, that's kind of how I see the differentiation in roles. Like some people's strengths can be other people's weaknesses. So sort of compensating for those, I think, is really helpful. In terms of, I'm trying to think of 96 and 101, just how you would use them differently. Because I think 102 is, I think with 96 and 101, you might use them more for grammar things and for sentence structure and things of that nature. And, you know, having them go outside with the tutor during class and talking about things, like I could definitely see that being more worthwhile in those two classes. So yeah, I think that's the most important thing, especially with 96, because they're a smaller group anyway. I think really getting them that individual time with the tutor during class can be really, really useful because they have so many things they could be working on. So yeah, that's how I feel about 96.
Yeah, and you know, just reminded me of something too, is that the tutor can be really integral in helping a student to catch up. So if a student has missed, if they were sick, if life got in the way and they missed an important lesson, then a tutor can pull the student into the hallway and say, "This is what you missed."
And especially if you have a 96 or a 101 097, like you have that extra class time. Like that is especially when you should be using your tutor.
Yeah.
Wow.
Often I will require my students to meet with a tutor if they haven't done well on an assignment. They can't turn in the next assignment until they've met with the tutor. And also, if they've fallen behind, I'll require that they meet with the tutor in order to get caught up. And that support is unbelievable. I know that there are a lot of cliches thrown around about city colleges and community colleges and tutors, but the reality is, and I've seen this semester after semester for a very long time, the reality is that we will always have students who are marginal, who are in that gray area between acquiring the skills and passing the class and maybe just not making it. And embedded tutors are the people that make the difference. As you know, getting a college degree changes lives. And for our students in particular, it not only changes their lives, but it often changes the life of their whole family and all the future generations. And I've seen countless times where students just can't quite make it over the finish line. They're just lacking skills or they need some type of additional support. The embedded tutor provides that support and they make it. English composition classes are gateway classes. Statistically, if a student passes the composition sequence, they are extremely likely to get whatever degree they came for, whether it's an associate's or even going on for a bachelor's. So, really, here, when I say that you are changing lives and you are helping the people who wouldn't have otherwise made it across that finish line to get that extra boost or extra support in order to do that. So thank you for what you do.